Alright guys, let's talk war. So, the Civil War was fought by men, but it was won by technology. Without the North's ability to produce manufactured goods, without their ability to field modern technology, the South honestly would have had a pretty good chance at beating them. Even though they were severely at a disadvantage, their leadership in the first 2 or 3 years was absolutely brilliant. Well, it's the first modern war. As a result of increased technology, increased manufacturing capability, it is, in fact, the first time that we're going to see some modern inventions like repeating rifles, ironclad warships, electronic communications, the telegraph. And so we're going to stop and we're going to take a look at each of these just bit by bit. The Manet ball is definitely the most important piece of weaponized technology we can discuss. The North produced millions of these spiral-cut lead balls that were actually a cone shaped like the one on the screen. They're incredibly accurate. They're rifled. They spiral just like we had talked about rifle marksmen in the Revolution. Well, they produce a tremendous amount of damage. If you didn't die, you're probably going to wind up looking like some of these guys with some serious disfigurements. The fatality rate for getting hit by a Manet ball was incredibly high. Modern medical technology, which I will address in probably maybe the next video, is going to come about as a result of the amount of damage that these things deal. They're absolutely just incredible how much severe trauma a single shot could produce. The most important piece of non-weaponized technology on the list is by far the telegram. It allows for the North to send and receive communications way faster than any army in history had ever been able to do, because it was electronic. It was just like turning on a light switch. You don't have to wait for the light to come on. You didn't have to wait for the signal to be sent or received. The North had way more telegraph lines than the South as a result of their industrialization. Lincoln himself paid to have one installed in his war room in the White House in the Treaty Room so that he was able to instantaneously communicate with his generals almost anywhere that they were. He personally directed the war effort. A telegraph is basically a machine that converts tapping into an electrical signal. So you put your finger on the button and a series of dashes and dots, so long and short tapping, is what is going to allow you to send a message that the operator on the other end translates into the alphabet, into a written message. You can't talk about the Civil War and not talk about cameras. Cameras changed the way that America looked at war. This modern battlefield was nothing but horror. And so they wanted to be able to bring those horrors straight to the president, to his advisors, to the people. So they published them in newspapers. They sent them out in reports. They wanted people to understand exactly how violent war had become. It was no longer gentlemen crossing swords, but instead it was young boys, young men, shooting at each other, tearing limbs off, destroying each other literally and metaphorically on a battlefield. It was no longer glory. And so the American people are going to start seeing photos of these things, and they're going to be horrified because what they had kind of romanticized as the glories of war are really just going to turn into a horrific. So now the question becomes, what allowed such large numbers of men, numbering into the hundreds of thousands, to be able to travel so quickly to their deaths? Well, the answer is pretty simple. It's the train. The train allowed for the North to send way more men and materials to battlefields than the South could. The North had nearly 20,000 miles of railway track compared to only about half that in the southern states. And most of that was destroyed by Sherman on his march through the land. When Sherman came marching down through the South, he made sure that he decimated their infrastructure. He left nothing that they could use behind. He heated up railroad ties and turned them into basically big pretzels that he called Sherman's neckties. The trains were really the saving grace of the North, because without them, they couldn't have moved their heavy guns, they couldn't have moved gunpowder and supplies nearly as quickly as they could in order to bring the fight to the South. This brings us to the last important piece of technology that really pushed the United States into the 21st century in about 40 more years. The ironclad is the first modern warship. They sit low in the water, they have sloped sides covered in iron plating, and they allowed for an effective blockade of ports in the north and the south. Both sides had access to these modern machine marvels. They were steam powered. They could deflect cannon fire thanks to their armor plating. They had reinforced hulls under the water that made them very, very sturdy against ram attacks if someone tried to sink it by running into it. They were designed to basically be unstoppable. And they did a very good job. And this is what gave the United States its original idea for a steel warship at the turn of the century, whenever we start preparing to engage in some territorial expansion outside of the continental U.S. That was a lot. Those are 5 major categories of technology that you're going to see. You might run into them in high school. You probably will, especially the ironclads. That's always a really big, popular topic for high school teachers. At least it was when I was in high school. It hasn't been that long ago. Understand that the South is still going to be struggling to come up with the machines and the technology to conduct a war because they just don't have the industrialization. They don't have the infrastructure, the railways, the telegraph lines that the North has. So they're going to constantly be kind of in a battle against themselves to be able to try and provide some of that for themselves. In 1860, there wasn't a single rifle production company in the South. They were all located up north, which means that if the South wanted guns, they had to buy them from the Union. Well, obviously, if you're at war with the Union, you're not buying guns from them. So they depended on Great Britain and France to supply them with firearms, which is something we're going to get into when we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. But I think at this point in our day, we should have a pretty good idea that the South is really rural. There's not a lot of technology. There's not been a lot of progress in the last 50 or so years. Everything is still very much like it was at the end of the Revolution. They're still trading with England. They are buying goods from other countries to avoid doing business with the North because now the North and them are going to wind up in war. They're going to wind up at each other's throats, so to speak. And I think we've all been there. We've all had those feelings of I'm going to do whatever I have to do to make sure you suffer. Well, that's what the South says to the North. And by the end of the Civil War, it's going to be flipped. And you're going to see the North saying that to the South. And I think that by the time we get through the Emancipation Proclamation, we get through what we're going to get through these next couple weeks as we're still out and not back in class. You are going to see a huge shift in the attitudes towards tolerance in the United States. Which is something that we have seen in the last 50 or so years here, that it's no longer going to be tolerating certain things. It's going to be either my way or the highway. And so we're going to see some parallels between now and then, which I think will be very good for all of us. So don't look at any doorknobs, don't waterfall, doesn't kill corona, wash your hands.